In the summer of 1304, the siege of Stirling Castle was effectively over. The Scottish garrison had held out for 4 months. They were starving, outnumbered, and out of options. 30 men, led by a knight named William Oliphant, sent word to King Edward I of England that they were ready to surrender, and Edward said no, not because he wanted them dead, because his machine was not finished yet. For 3 months, 5 master carpenters and 49 laborers had been assembling something in the English camp. A machine so large that, taken apart, it filled 30 wagons. The English called it Warwolf, and it is believed to be the largest trebuchet ever built. Edward I had spent a fortune on it, and he refused to accept the keys to the castle until his machine had hurled its 300-pound stones at the walls his enemies were standing on. Think about that. A king delayed his own victory because he wanted to see a weapon work. The story of why that machine was worth more to him than the surrender itself is the story of the most powerful engine of the entire Middle Ages. And it starts with a problem that has nothing to do with wood or stone. It starts with the problem of human muscle. Here is what most people get wrong about the trebuchet. It looks like a catapult with a longer arm. It is not a catapult at all. A catapult stores energy in twisted rope or bent wood, and that energy fades as the fibers wear out. The trebuchet has no springs and no tension. It is a gravity engine. It runs on the one force in the medieval world that never tired, never varied, and never broke down. And the road to that idea took more than 15 centuries. To understand why the counterweight trebuchet changed siege warfare, you have to go back to the machine that came before it. Picture a wall in China, sometime around the 4th century BC. In front of it stands a wooden frame with a long arm pivoting on an axle. On the short end of the arm hang dozens of ropes. On the long end hangs a sling with a stone in it. This is the traction trebuchet, and its power source is a crowd. On command, a team of pullers, anywhere from a handful of men to more than 100, yanks the ropes downward in unison. The long arm whips upward, the sling snaps forward, and the stone flies toward the wall. The design spread west for 1,000 years, and by the 6th century it had reached the Mediterranean world. It worked. A good crew could throw stones of up to 50 kilograms, roughly 150 meters, and they could do it quickly, shot after shot. But the traction trebuchet had a ceiling built into it, and that ceiling was made of people. Every pull was different. Men tire, men flinch. Men pull a fraction of a second late, or a fraction too weak, and the stone lands somewhere new every time. Worse, the only way to make the machine stronger was to add more pullers, and 100 men take up space, eat food, and cannot pull in perfect unison no matter how well you drill them. So siege commanders faced a frustrating equation. You could have a fast machine powered by muscle, or you could dream of a harder-hitting machine that muscle could not deliver. You could not have both. For centuries, nobody solved it, until someone stopped using men as the engine and started using the planet. The first person to clearly describe the solution in writing was a scholar named Mardi ibn Ali al-Tarsusi, working in the service of Saladin around the year 1187. In a military manual he prepared for the Sultan, al-Tarsusi described a trebuchet powered not by pulling crews but by a massive falling weight, and he explained exactly why it was better. In words that still hold up as engineering analysis more than 8 centuries later. A counterweight machine, he wrote, delivers the power of a 50-man pulling team because it works by the constant force of gravity, whereas men differ in their pulling force. Read that again. The constant force of gravity. That is the whole revolution in a single phrase. Al-Tarsusi even credited the knowledge to an Armenian weapons expert in Muslim service, which tells us the idea was already moving between cultures, workshop to workshop, siege to siege. This machine seemed like a modest upgrade at the time. It was not. It was the moment siege warfare stopped depending on how hard men could pull and started depending on how well engineers could calculate. Because here is the thing about a counterweight trebuchet. You could not simply drag one to a siege. For the giant machines, you built it there in front of the enemy over weeks or months. The army arrived carrying the precious parts, iron axle fittings, rope, tools. Hundreds of carefully forged bolts and rings. The timber came from wherever the war was, and finding it was its own campaign. A great trebuchet needed beams the size of ship masts, and oak that thick does not grow next to every castle. Carpenters shaped the frame with axes and adzes while the enemy watched from the walls day after day as the thing in the siege camp grew taller than their own towers. The counterweight box was a timber crate built to hold 10 tons of ballast, sometimes more, without bursting at the seams. Crews filled it with whatever the land offered: stones, gravel, lead if the commander was rich, earth if he was not. And while the carpenters worked, masons did something that sounds almost modern. They manufactured ammunition to specification, chipping quarried boulders into rounded balls of consistent weight, because a machine this precise deserved projectiles to match. Stone balls recovered from one 14th century siege site weigh as much as 230 kilograms each. That is ammunition heavier than an upright piano produced by hand by the hundreds. So what did all that effort buy you? A full-sized counterweight trebuchet stood as tall as a 5- or 6-story building. It swung an arm over 10 meters long. It threw stones of 100 to 150 kilograms to ranges around 2 to 300 meters. And the biggest machines, like Edward's Warwolf, hurled projectiles of 300 pounds. Reliable? Almost perfectly. Fast? Not remotely. The giants managed roughly a couple of shots per hour. That sounds like a weakness. It was actually the point. Because what the trebuchet gave up in speed, it returned in something no other weapon of the age could offer: repeatability. And to see why, you have to look inside the machine. This is where the real engineering lives. Start with the frame. 2 massive A-shaped trestles, braced and pegged into a base that spreads the load across the ground, because every shot slams the structure with forces that would tear a lesser frame apart. Between the trestles runs the axle, a smooth timber shaft capped in iron, and this axle carries everything. Over it pivots the beam, the long throwing arm, and the beam is deliberately lopsided. The section on the counterweight side is short and thick. The throwing side is long and tapered, 5 to 6 times the length of the short side. That ratio is the machine's first gear. When the counterweight end drops 1 meter, the throwing tip travels 5 or 6. Now, the energy source. At the short end hangs the counterweight box, and notice that word. Hangs. On the best machines, the box is not bolted rigidly to the beam. It swings from a hinge, and we will come back to why that hinge matters, because it is the smartest piece of wood in the entire machine. To cock the trebuchet, crews haul the long arm down with winches, and on the biggest engines, men climb inside tread wheels, human hamster wheels taller than a rider on horseback, walking tons of dead weight up into the sky. A locking mechanism holds the beam down, and a ratchet stops the winch from spinning backward and killing everyone beside it, which is not a theoretical risk when 10 tons are straining to fall. Then comes the part almost everyone underestimates: the sling. 2 ropes and a leather pouch lying in a wooden trough under the machine. One rope is tied to the throwing tip. The other ends in a simple loop slipped over an iron pin. The sling is a genius upgrade because it acts as an extension of the arm, adding meters of throwing length and a whiplash acceleration at the end of the swing, while weighing almost nothing. And that iron pin is the machine's trigger, sight and fire control computer in one. Its angle decides the exact moment the loop slips free, which decides the angle the stone flies. Bend the pin forward, the stone flies flatter and harder. Bend it back, the stone climbs higher and drops steeper, sailing over a wall instead of punching it. When the crew pulls the release, the sequence takes about 1 second. The counterweight falls. The beam whips over the axle. The sling drags down the trough, snaps outward, and cracks like the end of a whip. The loop leaves the pin, and a rock, the weight of 2 grown men, leaves the machine faster than highway traffic. Notice what the machine cannot do, though. It cannot turn. There is no traverse wheel, no swivel. The trebuchet throws along one line. The line its frame points down, and swinging tons of timber onto a new target could take hours of levering and dragging, which means aiming did not begin at the trigger. It began days earlier when the engineer chose the patch of ground the machine would be born on. Placement was the first calculation of the entire siege. Every choice in that chain cost something and bought something. The long arm bought speed and paid in timber stress. The heavy counterweight bought power and paid in loading time. The sling bought range for free, which is why every serious trebuchet had one. But raw power was never the trebuchet's real weapon. Its real weapon was mathematics. Gravity pulls exactly the same way on every single shot. So once the crew found their target, the machine became a repeating instrument. The first stone might fly long. The engineers shortened the sling a touch, or shaved the pin angle, or shifted ballast in the box. The second stone landed closer. The third landed on the money. And then every stone after that hit the same few square meters of wall, hour after hour, day after day. Castles were not knocked down in an afternoon. They were drilled, one hammer blow at a time, on a single seam of masonry until it cracked. No pulling crew on Earth could do that. Gravity could do nothing else. There was one rule the crew broke on pain of destroying their own machine. Never fire it empty. It sounds backwards, but the stone is not just the weapon. It is the brake. A loaded shot pours the counterweight's energy into the projectile and sends it away. Fire with a botched sling or no stone at all, and all of that energy stays home, with nowhere to go except into the beam, the axle, and the frame. The machine beats itself to pieces on its own power. Keep that rule in mind. At the very end of this story, an army on the far side of the world is going to learn it the hard way. None of it worked without people, though, and the people are easy to forget. A giant trebuchet ran on dozens of them, winch teams and treadwheel walkers, sweating tons of stone into the air a few centimeters per step. Loaders wrestling boulders into the sling pouch. Carpenters checking the frame between shots for opening joints, because a cracked beam under full load did not give a warning, it gave shrapnel. Masons rounding the next day's ammunition. An engineer, and that word is not decoration, watching every impact and translating it into adjustments. 2 shots an hour sounds slow until you realize each shot was a full industrial operation, performed outdoors in range of enemy archers, by men who had been doing it since dawn. And the ammunition itself became a language of siege warfare. Round stone was the standard, the wall breaker. Firepots spread burning material onto wooden roofs and hoardings inside the fortress. And then there is the darkest chapter. In 1346, at the siege of Caffa on the Black Sea, a Mongol army dying of plague is said to have thrown its own dead over the walls of the city. In the traditional telling, Genoese ships fleeing that harbor then carried the Black Death toward Europe. It is one of the most famous trebuchet stories ever told, so you should know its real status. The account comes from a chronicler named Gabriele de Musi, who was not there, and modern historians are split. Some call it the best explanation for how the plague entered the city. Others argue it probably never happened at all. We cannot simply stamp it true or false. What we can say is that the fear was real, because everyone in that world understood what a trebuchet could deliver over a wall. There was one more problem the trebuchet crews had to solve, and it was not made of wood or stone. It was the men on the wall, because the defenders were not simply standing there, taking it. Look at the siege from their side for a moment. Out beyond the moat stands a machine that took the enemy months to build. It cannot move. It cannot hide. It cannot defend itself. It is made of timber, rope, and grease, and it is worth more than everything else in that camp put together. To a defending garrison, a great trebuchet was not just a terror. It was a target, the single most valuable target on the entire battlefield. And medieval defenders had 3 answers to it: burn it, outshoot it, or learn to take the punch. Fire came first, because fire was cheap. Under cover of darkness, small parties slipped out through hidden sally ports, the concealed doors built into the castle for exactly this purpose. carrying pots of burning pitch and bundles of oiled straw. Their mission was simple: reach the machine, set it alight, and run. If they succeeded, months of carpentry became ash by sunrise. It happened over and over across the history of siege warfare. During the Great Siege of Acre in the Third Crusade, the defenders destroyed the besiegers' engines with incendiaries, and the attackers had to begin again from raw timber. This is why siege engines grew armor of their own. Crews draped the frames in raw, wet animal hides that would not catch easily. They ringed the machine with palisades and earth banks. They posted night guards around it, the way a modern army guards its artillery. The wall breaker ended up needing its own bodyguard. The second answer was to shoot back. Castles mounted throwing engines of their own on towers and platforms, and the defenders held a quiet advantage that comes straight from the physics. Height. An engine firing from the top of a tower starts its shot from higher ground, which stretches its reach and lets it strike attackers who believe they are standing safely out of range. So the real duel of a siege was never simply machine against wall. It was engineer against engineer. The attacker's master walked his shots, one adjustment at a time, onto a chosen seam of masonry. The defender's master walked his own shots onto the huge, immobile, flammable machine sitting in front of his city. The attacker answered by digging his engine in behind earthworks, screening it with timber, and setting up at the very edge of his range, where the defender's stones fell short and his own could still reach. And when hits did land on the wall, the garrison had learned how to absorb them. The threatened stretch of wall walk was cleared of men, because the engineers on both sides knew exactly which section was being drilled. Carpenters braced the masonry from behind with heavy timber. Work crews hung whatever padding they could find to soften the blows, and when darkness stopped the bombardment, they climbed onto the damage and rebuilt it, stone by stone, before dawn brought the next shot. A castle wall under siege was not a passive slab of rock. It was a living system with a repair crew inside it, healing at night what the machine broke during the day. This is one of the reasons sieges stretched on for months. Both sides were engineering at full speed, in opposite directions, and the contest only ended when one side ran out of time, food, or ideas. Which raises the question that decided real sieges. In a duel like that, what actually wins? Not a lucky shot, not courage, throughput. The side whose machine could deliver more energy onto the same target for more days without shaking itself to pieces won the argument. And that is exactly why the smartest piece of wood in the counterweight trebuchet matters so much. Now back to that hinge, because it is the single best window into how sophisticated these builders really were. On a rigid machine, with the box bolted straight to the beam, the counterweight swings through a wide arc, wasting energy hauling itself sideways and slamming the whole frame at the bottom of the stroke. Hang the box from a hinge instead, and the physics transforms. The weight falls closer to straight down, keeping its full force pulling on the beam for longer, feeding more of its energy into the stone instead of into shaking the machine apart. The frame kicks less, the timbers last longer, the shot flies harder. Modern simulations confirm the hinged design converts dramatically more of its stored energy into the projectile. Medieval builders had no equations for any of this. They found it with their eyes, their ears, and their broken frames, and they standardized it centuries before anyone could write the formula. And we know exactly how good their answer was, because in 1989 a museum team in Denmark built a full working counterweight trebuchet from the historical evidence. And it worked. The machine, now standing at Warwick Castle in England, follows that same research. 18 meters tall, 22 tons, more than 300 pieces of oak. It throws projectiles of up to 150 kilograms about 300 meters. 7 centuries later, the design still does exactly what Al-Tarsuzi promised. There is one more legacy hiding in these machines, and it is sitting in your job title if you build things for a living. The men who designed and ran them were called ingeniators, from the Latin ingenium, meaning cleverness, designers of siege engines and fortifications. That word became engineer. For most of its life, it meant a military profession. The peaceful meaning we use today did not become standard until the 19th century. Every engineer alive carries a little of the siege camp in their name, which brings us back to Stirling in the summer of 1304 to watch everything converge. Edward I had brought an arsenal of siege engines against a castle held by 30 men, and still he wanted more, because Stirling sat on rock that laughed at ordinary stones. So his chief engineer went to work. And here is the detail that makes it perfect. That engineer was Master James of St. George, the greatest castle builder of the age, the man behind the mighty Welsh fortresses of Caernarfon, Conwy, and Harlech. The best defense architect in Europe spent 3 months building the ultimate wall breaker. 30 wagons of parts, 54 craftsmen and laborers. A machine without an equal anywhere on earth. When Oliphant's starving garrison offered their surrender in July, Edward turned them down and, by the account that has come down to us, kept them on the walls until Warwolf was ready to fire. The great beam swung. 300-pound stones crossed the sky over Scotland. Chroniclers record that the machine smashed through Stirling's defenses, and archaeologists working at the castle centuries later found the skeleton of a man bearing more than 160 fractures. Researchers have suggested he may have stood in the path of Edward's machine. On the 24th of July, the garrison was finally permitted to surrender. The most powerful gravity engine ever built had fired its shots at an enemy who had already given up. As a weapon, it was hardly needed. As a message, it was priceless. The end came the way it always comes, from the next machine. In the 14th and 15th centuries, gunpowder bombards grew from curiosities into wall breakers, and the mathematics of the falling weight lost to the chemistry of the explosion. Within a few generations, the trebuchet slid from superweapon to museum piece. Its last performance was pure tragicomedy. In 1521, at the siege of Tenochtitlan, Hernán Cortés ran short of gunpowder and ordered his men to build a trebuchet from memory. Nobody in that camp had the old knowledge. Nobody tuned the sling or checked the pin. Bernal Diaz, a soldier who stood there watching, recorded the result. The first stone went straight up, came straight back down, and smashed the machine to splinters. The rule the medieval crews lived by, broken by the last army ever to try. 4 centuries of accumulated craft, gone from the world's workshops in a single forgotten generation. But look at what the trebuchet actually proved, because it is bigger than any one siege. It proved that a calculated machine beats human muscle, that a constant force, properly harnessed, beats a strong one, that ammunition made to specification, adjustments made by measurement, and energy managed through a hinge could bring down structures that armies could not touch. That is not medieval thinking. That is engineering, practiced by the men whose very name we inherited. And it explains the image this story keeps coming back to. A starving garrison offering a king their surrender, and the king looking past them at a half-finished wooden giant in his camp and saying, in effect, "Not yet." Edward I understood something that has outlived him by 700 years. The most valuable weapon is not the one that kills the most men. It is the one that makes resistance pointless. And on a July day in 1304, that weapon ran on nothing but wood, rope, and the patient, constant pull of the earth itself. If you found this interesting, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us which siege machine you want to see. Broken down next. And if you haven't already, give this video a like so more people can find it.